In part 2, we're going to start off exactly where we left off in part 1, and we're going to generate the foil component that the gum sits on that you press from the top down to break through. The back has just a little bit of a bubble itself, and that's what we're going to end up modeling. So our starting point is with the clear plastic. And you can see in the first tutorial we actually did model some geometry for that foil backing, but we're going to end up deleting that because I decided to change the way we're doing it. So I'm going to press the X key, selecting clear plastic. We're going to duplicate the object. We're not going to duplicate linked, and then just press the escape key so it's in exactly the same position. We're going to turn off the clear plastic because we're going to keep that. We're going to come down here and we're just going to remove both of the modifiers. And what I want to do is come up to the cursor, and we're going to place the cursor on the bottom. In fact, I'm going to come over here in view, and I'm going to do lock to 3D cursor. So now you can see how I can rotate around that, which is quite useful. Let's come to the front. Tab key goes into edit mode, and I'm going to press the A key because we want to scale this so that it inverts, so that the bubble is on the bottom. But one of the things that we want to do before we even do that is remove some of the geometric components that we don't need. So I'm going to switch over into edge mode, and we're going to remove these, and we're going to remove these. Now, remember, this is where those kind of selections you need to be aware that X-ray mode needs to be on, or else the selection won't go all the way through. Okay, so there you can see it's gone all the way through. Bring up the context menu and then do dissolve edges. Option Z takes us out. Okay, let's come back into the front. A key, and then we're going to, what I want to do is I want to scale from this point. You can see right now it's going to scale where the scaling widget is. So I'm going to press the period key, and we're going to go pivot point to 3D cursor. Now we can press the S key and only go along the Z-axis, so press Z and just pop that down. And in fact, I'm going to overemphasize it for right now. Okay, now it's still too emphasized, but what I want to do is sort of form this, remodify this just a little bit. I'm actually going to turn off the 3D cursor now because that's going to get in the way in just a little bit. We're going to switch over to the bottom view, so press the tilde key and then come down to bottom. We need to remove all of these cells if you want to think about them that way. So I'm going to switch over into face mode. We want to be in X-ray, and then noting that I'm in select box, I can marquee around all of them except that top right corner. And you need to make sure and encompass the little dot. So here I'm going to do the same all the way down to the bottom. X key, and we're going to delete those faces. Okay, so let's come back up here and focus on this area. In fact, I'm going to temporarily switch over just so you can see perspective-wise kind of what it is we're doing. Option Z to turn off X-ray, and I'm going to switch over into vertex mode, and we're going to use the 3D cursor tool, and I want to move this to this location because we're going to do a little bit of subtle forming to the topology of this, what I'm going to call an inverse bubble. Okay, so we need to come back and turn on snapping, and we need to come over here and take it from active to closest. I've discovered that if active is on, the 3D cursor won't snap correctly. So we're going to come and turn this back to closest, and then I can simply grab that and snap it to that location. Okay, so let's come back into edge mode, and I'm going to double click those edges, hold the shift key and select those edges. Now, if we come back into the front view, let's turn perspective off and zoom in. What I can do is I can subtly scale from that location. So if I press the S key and then Z, I can just scale those just a little bit like that. So now with these selected, let's switch over to the side view. And I'm going to have us sort of move those down. So we're just changing the topology a little bit to make it slightly more rounded. Okay. Come back into the front view. We're going to switch over into vertex mode. I want to make sure X-ray is on because we're going to marquee through the whole top. And what I'd like to do is take this cursor and move it back to this flat planar area. So we'll just come over here to the 3D cursor tool, make sure snapping is on, and I can grab this and move it to any of those as long as they're on that flat planar area. Now when we come over to the scale tool, I can just scale and bring that down pretty far because it's going to be a subtle feature. Okay. Now what I want to do is I want to add a little bit of topology, another loop around here to give it a little bit more constraint when it subdivides around here to give more definition to the bubble that the gum is pushed through. So we'll come over to the loop cut function and I'm going to bring that in. Now we've got snapping on. I'm going to turn snapping off because that'll sort of get in the way, and I can just bring that down a little bit more closely, about like that. Okay, so there we go. If we were to come over here and turn on subdivision by adding a subdivision surface model, let me take that to a value of 2 and press the tab key to leave edit mode, we can go into shaded and we can see that it's just got that slight bubble topology that we want for the bottom. But we're going to be using sculpting, so we can't use the subdivision modifier. So I'm actually going to remove that, and we're going to add a multi-res modifier. So the first thing that we need to do, just come over here and add multi-resolution. Now remember, it doesn't initially subdivide it. It leaves everything at 0. So we're going to press subdivide 3 times. Okay, let's come into shaded view, and what I want to do is I want to come over here and turn perspective on. Now this drives me crazy when it does that. That's why the lock to 3D cursor can be really useful. So we're going to come over here and we're going to go into sculpting mode. And let's actually look at this from the bottom. So I'm going to press the tilde key and we're going to go to bottom. We're going to turn perspective off. We want to initially sculpt this, but we want to mask out the parts that we don't want the painting to affect. What we want to form is we want to form the little ripples in the foil, as if the foil is not perfect and it's got some slight creases in it. We're going to first mask off the parts that we don't want to be affected. And we're going to scroll down here in all of these tools, and there's one here called box mask. And this is easy because you can just quickly box off, and you can see in the shading, it's just kind of subtle. You can get kind of right up to that edge, right up to it like that. And then we're going to come over to the mask tool and just paint off the corners. And in fact, because it adds a little bit of gradation to it. So I'm actually going to paint just a little bit like this. It's going to be organic too. And I just want that to be slightly feathered. Get right to the corner. And again, because this is organic, we're not trying to be perfectly exact. There we go. And now what I want to do is I want to come in and increase the size quite a bit and just sort of roughly paint off sort of the center area like that, because we don't want it to fully come in. It doesn't need to be perfect, just something roughly about like that. So now we're going to come up to the basic inflate function. Let's decrease the size back to maybe about 50, and you can start to paint. Now I'm going to undo once, and I'm going to have us change the lighting to matte cap, and then kind of go to the red, and you can play with it. There's not one that is exactly perfect. And you can see I'm just going to paint in some of these creases, just roughly like that. Now hold the control key down and you can go inward in the negative direction as opposed to positive, and just you can paint these sort of creases in about like that. And then you can come over to the smooth function, increase it a bit, and then you can just play with, smoothing out any areas that you feel maybe are a bit too strong. And I think that works pretty well. Let's come back over here and return to studio lighting. And let's come back to object mode. And there, when you look at it carefully, you can see just that hint of organic, the crinkling that is in that shape. In fact, if we rotate down, let me turn on perspective, you can kind of get a sense for what that looks like. So now we just need to duplicate that to all of the other cell locations, to the gum locations. So now we need to duplicate these. But since we've only painted one, if we just duplicate this into all the other sections, they're all going to look the same. And we want to produce a little bit of variation. So let's turn off perspective. Let's press the tilde key and come into bottom view. I'm going to turn off multi-res temporarily, just at a display standpoint. And let's press the tab key to go into edit mode. So we're going to do the duplication in vertex mode. So vertex mode actually has built into it sort of quasi understanding that you're also working with the fills of the vertices. So it's a hybrid between vertex and face mode. So I'm going to hold the shift key, select that corner, and then select it again to make it the active vertex of all the vertices that we have selected. Press Shift and D, and we're going to move that over. But now we want to turn on snapping and make sure we go back into active mode. So now I can press the G key and just snap that into the location. So what I'm going to do now is press Shift D, and we're going to come up and snap to that right there. So we have these three that are exactly the same. And an easy thing that we can do is rotate this one by 180 degrees. So if I'm in the rotation tool, you can see that I'm not seeing the pivot for that. The pivot is set to a different mode. So it's set to go to where the 3D cursor is. So I'm going to press the period key, and we're going to go to bounding box center, and then I can rotate this, type 180. There we go. So that produces a visible variation. For the middle one, I'm going to select those vertices and press Command L, which is the same as coming over to select and going down to select linked, and it'll select all of those, because these two are individual polygon islands. But in this particular case, what I want to do is scale it. So I'm going to press S key, and then along the y-axis, I'm going to press Y and then -1. Now when we do that, you have to hit return. It's going to also invert the normals. So if I come over and we turn on face orientation, you can see that the face orientation for those isn't correct. So now we need to come over here to mesh, normals, and we need to flip those to come back into the correct direction. But now we have this variability in that crinkling that we've painted in. Okay? So let's come over and turn off face orientation. Still in vertex mode, marquee around these. Now, again, you have to be really cognizant of being in X-ray mode when you have overlapping elements. Okay. Do the same thing, hold the Shift key. Let's deselect, then select that to make it the active element. Shift D. We're still in snapping. Okay. And what I'm going to do, since I have that selected, is we're going to introduce randomization here. So we're just going to take this and we're going to rotate it as a whole section by 180. Okay, so we still have this active element. We can use that because we have all of these edges right here. Shift D, and I'm going to pop that right till it gets there. And then Shift R to duplicate that. And I think rotate 180. That is going to be enough. That's going to be enough randomization to make it look right. So let's come back over here, and we're going to press the tab key to leave edit mode, and let's turn back on. Turn off X-ray. There we go. So we've produced randomization apparently from just one master, but we need to weld all of these together. So I'm going to come back into tab mode, A key, bring up the context menu. Because we're in vertex mode, we're going to merge vertices by distance, and the default distance, which is right here, is sufficient to weld all those together. And we had 162 vertices that were welded together. Tab key to leave edit mode. Now you can see that those are all welded. Okay. So, perfect. So the next thing that we need to do is UV map this, which is fortunately quite easy to do, given what it is being just a very flat object. Select it, tab key goes into edit mode. Those are the original UVs, which are all going to get thrown out. A key means we have everything selected, and we just come up to the UV menu here, and we're going to do a project from view. And I'm going to press the A key over in the UV side, S key, just to sort of scale those up. I'm not going to be super concerned about getting it to some absolute size, just so it roughly fits into the space. So let's come back over to modeling, and we need to give this some thickness. Let's leave perspective mode and come into the front view. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to turn back on so we can see the original piece. So what we need to do is just move it out of position, out of the original position that it was duplicated with. So press the G key and then Z, and then bring it down just slightly. Now there's snapping turned on, so let's go ahead and turn that off. You need just a little bit of a gap. So I'm going to press the G key, Z, and bring it just a little bit closer. The ray tracer needs that slight amount of gap. Now this original position is important because we're going to be adding another level of thickness to it. So the top, which is right underneath the clear plastic, has a hatch pattern on the metal, but the other side does not. So we're actually going to be applying two materials to this. So let's come back over here to the modifier stack, and we're going to add solidify to it. And we're going to note, let's collapse that it's pretty enormous. So let's do 0.006 inches. From seeing it edge on, we do want to see just that slight amount of thickness in the render. Now when we come over here, we're going to note that we can still see selected the original piece of geometry. So that's going to have one material applied to it, and the thickness is going to have a second material applied. Let's come down here to the material, and we're going to add two slots. The top slot here, we're just going to call this temporary. We're going to call this top hatch. And the bottom, we'll give this, and we'll just call that bottom for right now, just to differentiate. But we're not going to set the materials up at this point. But it is important to note that the top here, again, is the default material that's applied up here. So when we come over here to the modifier and down to material, there is a material index. And if you set the material index to a value of 1, what it's going to do is it's going to apply the second material to the thickness. So that's how it works. We're just simply going to set it up right now, and we're not going to try and set the materials themselves up. Okay, tab key to leave edit mode. So there we go. So we've got the top and the bottom. Let's come over here, re-enable that for rendering. I'm going to turn on subdivision. Let's turn on the gum pieces. And we have both sides set up.